All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special tinfoil hat edition of SecTalks Sydney live on YouTube for the fifth or sixth time this year. We can't wait to get back in, but we're actually really stoked that we can continue running these events during the restrictions. I'm just going to double check that I'm actually live. Ed, if you could just give me a heads up if I am, and I'm not just talking to myself. And then we'll get going. Okay, got the thumbs up. We're going to continue here. So welcome, as you know. We run this every second Tuesday of the month when we can. Live on YouTube. This is our new home for the foreseeable future. We have a very cool talk tonight, which I'll introduce the speaker just very shortly. Obviously, we want to give a shout out, first of all, to our sponsors who make this possible. I'll get to them in a sec, actually. So what is SecTalks if it's your first time here? Well, it is a non-profit, independent community meetup group situation where members such as yourself from the community give talks and presentations and do challenges and cool stuff. And we aren't held back by any corporate overlords or anything like that. Our sponsors just kind of help us keep the lights on and give us free beverages and venues sometimes, which is very cool. As the sponsors who I touched on before, PwC, Amazon Information Security, Google, Atlassian, and SecDim. So we thank all our sponsors as usual for helping us run these events. So if you want to get involved, we actually are looking for speakers for the last part of the year, September, October, November. Would love to hear from you. You can just get in touch with us via that link, or you can just email us at sydney@sectalks.org. If you want a shirt like the one I'm wearing, you can also grab them. There's a link down the bottom there where you can get yourself a shirt. I've also got a hoodie, but it's in the wash, so I can't wear that one right now, but it's really comfy. It's really warm right now. Well, it's really cold, but, you know, that's why you have hoodies. After the talk, there, as always, is the Slack channel. If you don't have an invite to the Slack channel, you can email us SecTalks, Sydney@sectalks.org, and we'll hook you up with an invite to the Slack channel. So we have a very topical talk today presented by Edward Farrell. He is from Mercury security consulting firm. I'm going to give a quick spiel. I'm reading this off. I don't actually know it off by heart. So he is a security consultant, 10 years experience in the information security industry, 15 years IT industry, director of Mercury ISS, one of the last few remaining independent security firms because all the rest of them have been acquired. He's done about 400 security assessment activities, incident response in the last 5 years. His professional highlights include lecturing at the ADF in Canberra, that's UNSW, rated in the top 200 bug bounty hunters in 2015, which is amazing because there was only 100 in 2015. And he runs an amazing team of security professionals. So I'm going to bring on Ed. Good evening. How are you?
Good. I thought it was a wise idea to wear a tinfoil hat for this evening. So
I've got mine, and make sure you wear yours as well.
Yes. Well, you know, all of the conspiracies and so on and so forth about CovidSafe. I guess it's a safe move. Yeah. All right.
Perfect. I'm going to disappear, and I'm going to let Ed take it away.
No worries. Well, I think I'm going to have to take this off because it's not staying on. All right. So just if someone can give us a shout out that they can see all the slides and everything in the... Yep, cool. There we go. They're up. So an approach to reviewing the CovidSafe app. Look, this evening's talk, I'm just going to go through a bit of myself, why I went down this path of researching, a bit on process and methodology and what I observed and how that turned into a bit of an iterative process. But also, interestingly enough, as we started going through this review activity, it started becoming very apparent that there was a lot of very unqualified opinion and analysis that started to evolve and come out. And I'll touch a little bit on that as well as some other really cool research that got done as well. And we'll conclude with some final thoughts. Also, just a final thought there on probably about where I think I started observing myself as we started to go down this research of, are we doing this to prove we're right and everyone else is wrong, or was this just, let's actually do something helpful? And hopefully that's one thing I'd like to see a few people get out of this evening's talk. So a bit about me. I run my own cybersecurity practice here in Sydney. We've done about 400 engagements now over the last 5.5 years. I have a really cool team as well. We're always keen to chat to people as well if anyone's keen to come on board. And, I'm still insistent anyone at any level should still remain in some way, shape or form technically literate. So what was this talk? This talk really came about from some of the research I was doing back in April and May, especially with some of the difficulties and challenges I was having as I started doing research and, observations I had, and actually cool things where it was like, no, actually the organization's done quite well. I'll go a little bit through how I took the approach, but also something became quite evident as I was doing research and as you started seeing folks talk about activities they were doing, is an act of being able to qualify what it is you've discovered. And I think this is a massive shortfall we have in cybersecurity. I'll also just touch a little bit on other people's research as well, and probably a little bit more on, if something like this pops out again, what our role is in communities like SecTalks. I think it's also important to note that this isn't a talk about how we own something and everything's insecure and the world is really bad. I also started sensing a lot during this period of research. There was a very idealistic approach that people started taking to what CovidSafe was and wasn't. And so you started to see this almost very politicized view of what this was, or an ideological one of, I'm here to defend the world, or, oh my God, the government's actually spying on us. But also, importantly, I think we started to see people take more of a what I would call a literature review or an execution of thought leadership that just really lacked that technical grounding. I'll also share in the Slack space a little bit later a few of my write-ups I did whilst I was going through this. So what actually brought about the research? So this kind of came about just either on Anzac Day or a little bit before it. A friend of mine works in a politician's office. They were kind of like, all right, how do I actually talk about the security of the app? And I said, well, wait, you're releasing this app? And it was getting released the next day on the 26th. And so I just said, well, look, let us have a look at it. Many eyes make bugs shallow, which then became a news. It became their punchline in one of their written pieces, which was interesting. You then also started having disinformation and conspiracy theories. So this kind of falls back into the coronavirus 5G anti-vaxxing thought process that started getting thrown around. Prior to this, as COVID was starting to hit, I started tagging into a couple of threat intel groups that were volunteering their time. And this was also where we started to see a surge in disinformation campaigns. But also my role at UNSW Canberra at the Defence Force Academy, there was some work I wanted to build out on Bluetooth as well. So this was a really cool opportunity to start playing with some tools that I've been employing or growing as part of the work I do down at ADFA. So the app got released Sunday afternoon on the 26th, and then it was till about 4 a.m. I believe it was 4 a.m. Monday, which was the 27th. I just started diving into it, setting up lab environments, just doing trial and error as I was enrolling accounts, unenrolling accounts, trying to interface with my phone trying to interface with my phone, trying to dump the contents on Bluetooth as well. And by about 4 a.m. Monday, the initial observations were the enrollment process was fairly straightforward. There were only a handful of APIs that were getting called. So Bluetooth, Bluetooth is then presenting some sort of encrypted value that I couldn't make sense of at the time. The app's talking over HTTPS. It's only got a handful of APIs it's talking to. You could start seeing some of the supporting infrastructure associated with the app, including an admin interface that someone actually called out and it eventually got taken down. There was also local data, which at the time I couldn't really qualify if there was a risk or if there was an issue with it or if there were any problems associated with that data. But this really was very much a trial and error. And then being sort of in the mobile and Bluetooth space, it meant that I was having to build an environment and tear it down, but not with the usual speed that you would have, say, if you were doing like if you were doing something in Docker or if you were doing something on a VM environment. So this took a lot of time and a lot of patience, which was why I had a very early morning during research. So after I get my environment set up and stabilized, I start looking at the supporting infrastructure. I start tearing up the APK just to see if there's anything of interest or of concern or if there's any private information. There was then also the process of actually mapping out the API calls that were getting made and understanding what those looked like. But I also had my own iPhone, and so Mercury itself, we have a Nexus 5X that we do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with. And so just because it's a device that, we've rebuilt and torn down constantly, the Nexus itself is just a phone that we've owned pretty hard, and we can dump contents off it quite easily. So that device, we're able to read the database on board. We're able to actually go through the interaction between the Nexus and the iPhone. So I had two separate registered accounts. We were also a little bit later on able to actually work out what was happening with Bluetooth. So this was what our test environment looked like. So I had my iPhone, which is my own live personal data that I was using. I then had the Nexus phone. In order to actually get that phone working and get the CovidSafe app working, I had to add in my own false certs. I also had to turn on Bluetooth debugging and just have a horribly, horribly insecure phone. So the phone itself would then talk into a wireless environment. I set up in a VM on my personal laptop, which allowed me just to Wireshark all the traffic, work out what the communications between the phone and the AWS environment that CovidSafe has been hosted on was, which would then just get routed out to the internet through my own home network. But then I was also able to do things like man in the middle of traffic using Burp Suite, and see what's actually getting requested and then get a bit of a better understanding of what's happening. So from here, this is a very, very small network diagram of what we were able to qualify by the 29th of April, and what we hypothesized based on what we could reasonably deduct from the interaction. So, at the start, you'd actually go through an initiation process, which would then qualify that someone is on that phone through an SMS. Off the back of which you would then have your identity validated as a result of that SMS, and then every hour or so, or every 30 minutes, you'd start getting a JWT call back to your phone, which is stored locally and broadcast over Bluetooth, and that gets constantly updated, which kind of deals with that privacy and tracking issue that a lot of people were really quite concerned about, that the app was actually introducing something that would allow someone to be quite easily tracked. And so this temp ID, which is the token request, which is constantly getting communicated and requested, has an expiry time. That's occurring at a very regular, as I said, I think that's occurring about every 30 minutes to an hour. So that refresh, ensures that the ID that's actually getting pushed out by the phone isn't something that you can start doing pattern of live tracking and analysis on. So off the back of the two boxes we have up the top there in green of here's the authentication process and here's the token request, we can start deducting a hypothetical backend of after a GET request is made with the personal data associated with an individual, it gets sent back into the AWS environment. A new encrypted value with personal details then gets sent back to the phone. Those are your personal details that you beacon out over Bluetooth. And then it's likely that that data is actually encrypted in a HSM and can only be decrypted under certain conditions based on a specific point in time. So I have not tested positive yet, so I don't know how this data upload function works. So this is a hypothetical that we can reasonably deduct based on the API calls that are present. So once again, a phone message, an SMS will get sent to validate that, yes, you're this person that's just been told that, congratulations, you've passed, you've tested positive. You now have to upload all this data that gets hypothetically sent into a separate database, gets decrypted, and then contacts can be readily traced from there. Once again, this is hypothetical based on what we can deduct from a reverse engineering of the application. Now, if we have a look at the interaction over Bluetooth, once two mobile phone devices have been identified and have been in proximity to each other, within about 15 minutes, apparently, they will both share a note of interaction in a local database, which is, it'll have the identity, it'll have a time, it'll have a message which contains the temp ID, which is the value that eventually gets decrypted. It'll also record the RSSI and transmit power. Now, the reason why that's important is RSSI tends to be a relative value. And so based on the phone model, it's reasonable to kind of work out, okay, based on the RSSI and the transmit power, we can determine that someone's been within this range of another person. That's at least my logic behind it, based on the phone model that is also sent at the same time. So there was this whole piece around the legal requirements of getting this app into production, and it was effectively the government had to legislate that you were not able to decrypt any data that's been encrypted. So reality is, if they're using the HSM, which rationally we've kind of deducted they are, because that's why they went for AWS, being able to get access to that's going to be really difficult. So provided those checks and balances that I mentioned back here are in place of you have a separate database from where you can actually do that decrypt function, and it's only done by someone in a response team under set conditions. This legal piece around privacy kind of gets met. Now, if you also look around this same time, there was discussion of Apple and Android starting to get their own tracing app underway. Now, because that's going to be a little bit more of a decentralized model, the assurances around privacy are a little bit harder to meet. Now, logically speaking, if you have a look, there's parts of how they were proposing it that kind of made a little bit more sense. But it came back to the lack of, I guess you could say, an authority of control over when and where something can be decrypted based on conditions that are kind of determined by government departments anyway. Kind of meant that model was a little bit harder to say this model actually makes more sense. I mean, it's a case of, 6 half dozen, one or the other, but I think there's probably a little bit more assurance around how crypto is being considered in this compared to, say, a far more decentralized model that's also being considered. So over time, I started collecting data on myself. I also went for a walk with a friend of mine for a bit. We probably would have walked past about 20 people. to see, all right, is the app actually talking with someone once? Is the app actually talking with someone? If we have that close proximity. I was also really keen as well with the settings I put in place on the Nexus to actually work out if there was any what I would call aggressive interaction with Bluetooth. So one of the things that I've hypothesized, and something I'm really curious to have a bit more of a look over the next few months, is everyone's always, putting on their tinfoil hat and saying that we're getting spied on with Bluetooth. I'm really curious to see if that was the case here. So this was a really cool little intro to working out if that had happened. Interestingly enough, over a 24-hour period, I recorded the interaction between my phone and the Nexus that we had in the test environment whilst I was sitting at my desk over that 24-hour period. And realistically, we didn't see a lot of records between my phone and the Nexus over that period of time. And so there's been this whole concern about, is the app actually working? And I think this comes back to some of the fundamental issues with Bluetooth and actually having Bluetooth working, is if the app wasn't actually in the foreground and constantly on, it was pretty ineffective. But also there's just, if you've ever done any sort of Bluetooth work, unless you're actually, focusing on it properly, it can be a little bit unreliable. So, in this case, it worked about 60% of the time. So there was also some really other cool research and analysis that was done. So there was a little bit of criticism directed towards the Digital Transformation Agency over picking AWS, but also spending a lot of money for a lot of teams to build out the app. One could actually go, oh, well, we could have just run a hackathon and, paid kids, a $500 gift card to deliver it, which, is fairly impractical. But I think there's probably a balance to be struck between blowing a lot of money on a project that kind of works versus, doing the whole, some uni kids can hack this together, and that's also going to be fine. There's also two really cool pieces of research as well, and I think this is going to be curious, especially if you have a look at Woot and DEF CON this year. There's been some really epic talks on vulnerabilities in Bluetooth, in the Bluetooth protocol itself, more so how it's implemented on Broadcom chipsets. But this one here was about a vulnerability that existed in Android where an individual could be readily identified. But that sort of research probably wouldn't have come about if it wasn't as a result of CovidSafe being published. There was also a really cool iOS denial of service piece of research that got done as well. This was courtesy of WOBS. Richard, I think you're also on SecTalks as well. But that was a really cool bug as well that got qualified, which, yeah, I really loved the video of that. So one of the points I really started hammering home, and it was something that I kept seeing come up, especially around, amongst privacy advocates that hadn't necessarily come from a technologically grounded environment, or even news reporters, was this whole thing of what I would call qualified analysis. So qualified analysis is a term that you see used a lot in intelligence agencies. In cybersecurity, we call it proof of concept, or GTFO. And so this was something that you saw. I mean, probably the more pronounced one I saw in this was a particular individual, and I probably got a little bit too critical of them when they said, if someone is a victim of domestic violence and they install this app, it means they're going to be tracked. At which point I kind of pulled out the criticism of, if someone is suffering from domestic violence, we've got other issues that we actually need to manage as a society, above and beyond an app that's designed to help track and expedite the process of isolating people that are infected. And you also saw this about people, who had come from authoritarian regimes being concerned about installing an app like this. And I think this comes back to, well, if we can at least maintain some sense of due diligence to the app, and, as as citizens remain critical of it and actually hold either improper or unnecessary functionality to account, that's going to be a better way to deal with those sort of anxieties than simply saying we shouldn't install something. There was a whole lot of piece and complaining about, well, the government spying on us using this app. The reality is, having looked at this, this is probably one of the, without having gone into the level of detail I would have liked to have, this is actually probably one of the better designed apps out there I've seen from I've just been analyzing this in my spare time. And so for me, the whole complaint about the government spying on you, I think, came from some very subjective analysis that made absolutely no sense. And I'll touch a little bit on that later. You also started seeing complaints as well about companies that didn't get awarded a contract to support this. You saw a massive kick up about, well, it's a national security threat that we're using AWS. The reality is some of the other data centers that got mentioned in the article that got published by the ABC really didn't have the depth of services that would have actually met the security requirements to actually host the app. So that HSM piece I was talking about before, based on what I had looked at, that's kind of going to be a critical requirement to enabling this. So the selection of Amazon actually made perfect sense. There was also a lot of complaints that, this is actually my personal opinion, but a lot of people that were making these complaints were your sort of cybersecurity or data center firm that have 12 managers and maybe one techie doing all the work. And suddenly they're upset about not actually getting the work. Another thing as well that was later qualified was that the app isn't actually recording GPS or any spatial data. It's purely recording, here's someone that you've been in close contact with that also has the software installed. And so I think this was kind of one of those driving things behind the government spying on me, was this notion that, well, we're getting recorded, at the end of which, well, there's other ways around that. So I guess this kind of comes back to a few other final thoughts I had, and I kind of wrote these up in my articles, which was, look, if you're really that genuinely concerned about privacy, do what I did and actually register with an incorrect name. That's actually, I think, probably one of the best things that you can do, especially, if you're one of these concerned citizens. If you can inject enough false or incorrect data about your personality into systems like this, so if there are, 100,000 Carol Baskins that are registered on this app, that throws off the entire concept of being able to get tracked without undermining the healthcare concerns that exist. So at the end of the day, a phone number is still associated with Carol Baskin. Carol Baskin's going to get called, and if you do happen to get a phone call calling for Carol Baskin, it's probably an indicator that you probably want to go get a test for COVID. Another one as well, and this kind of became one of those thoughts I had off the back of using the Nexus and my own iPhone, was I was still able to register. I was still able to register two phones with. I was still able to register two phones with that one number. So once again, if your concern is your phone number getting tracked to Carol Baskin, if you were to use someone else's phone number or even use a burner phone, that's going to neutralize that privacy concern, which really I don't think exists anyway. I also think some of the other stuff we see with COVID and with some of the research that's been underway here is this idea of citizen research and being able to actually dive into these apps to provide that collective assurance. And it's almost, I guess you could say, a civic duty of bug bounty hunting of let's actually go and explore these apps, but let's not explore them with the idea of finding an explicit vulnerability, but perhaps even just providing that positive assurance that an app is fine and doesn't present any vulnerabilities or any issues. It's also been curious to note that until very recently, contact tracing has actually had greater success as a result of people remembering people that they've actually been in contact with over the app. And so it's kind of probably one of those other concerns more broadly in the technology community of security may not have actually been our worry here. Have we just created technology for the sake of technology, and have we just identified a solution to a problem that didn't need to be solved? I also noted there before, there's been some really cool research that's popped out at DEF CON recently on Bluetooth and Wi-Fi that I think is going to be really interesting if everyone still has their Bluetooth turned on post-pandemic. So I'd be really curious to see if that actually starts playing a role in terms of there's underlying vulnerabilities in the tech stack that's getting used. Can that be used against individuals? I think that's going to be a really interesting point as the next 6 to 12 months unfold. And the same would also exist if the app isn't properly decommissioned as well. And I guess that's probably another point I noted in my write-up is if the app itself doesn't get decommissioned properly and all identities and the temp IDs that are getting broadcast don't get what we call zeroized, that's when you're actually going to have a tracing issue. That is, anyone can actually be traced because it's still presenting a legacy value long after someone's moved on. So look, that's it from me. I thought we might open up to a bit of Q&A if there's anything going on or anything out there. So the lines are open.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ed. Again, if anyone has any questions, please post them. There's 3 places you can post them, either just here in YouTube, which is easy for me, or in the Slack channel or in the IRC channel. I will start, if I could. Do you know, has the CovidSafe app been actually effective at all in tracing any of the outbreaks and actually resulting in some kind of action or isolation?
So some of the news stories out of Melbourne recently have said yes. When I was looking at this back in May, there was a lot of news articles saying that, well, we were able to trace people just as fast by asking someone who you've been in contact with. I think it's now curious, now that you're starting to get this second wave in Melbourne, looking at contact tracing down there. If you look at the volume and size of it relative to the to how many people have also installed the device, the app as well, I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. But so news articles so far have said, yeah, that's happening, but I haven't been able to qualify that in numbers. So I'd be curious.
And do you know what the adoption rate of the CovidSafe app was?
I do not know. When I was going through this, I think they said 2 million and then 4 million people had downloaded and installed it. But yeah, that could have been me 10 times. So
right,
I'd be curious at what those numbers are now. If anyone here on channel is from DTA, it would be great to just sort of see those numbers.
Perfect. I'm going to throw it over to some of the questions we have coming out of YouTube. Starting from the top, we've got Theng Loke. I hope that's correct. Where do I find other citizen research? And I assume they mean on the CovidSafe app.
So there's the 2 links I mentioned of people that have actually found some really cool CVEs. There was also and I should have actually talked about it, there was a Discord group called CovidSafe Watch that was doing a lot of diving into this as well. So they really, a couple of them really did come out with some interesting thoughts and ideas. Reality is I probably started to distance myself from that group as it was starting to take on some different tacks, and then I probably dropped some of the research I was doing about mid-May and just focused on work at that point. So I believe the group is still active. If you're looking at sort of other research projects, EFF always has interesting stuff as well. And they're always interesting to look at. Actually, there was a cool project they did recently on identifying stingrays, which got also released at DEF CON this weekend. So check that out. Yeah,
and for those who aren't aware, all of the DEF CON talks were pre-recorded and are available on the DEF CON website, so go check those out. Got another question from Dash on YouTube. What would you have done differently, such as design, implementation, or key decisions, if you were in charge of CovidSafe? Following that, would you have considered specialized hardware implementation, such as a Bluetooth bracelet?
Yeah, actually. So if I did this differently, I would have actually opened up to consultation. And I think doing that properly is quite difficult. And also, at what point are you exposing too much information? I think there's a piece of honesty is the best policy, as long as you're not being too honest. So if DCA wanted to neutralize a lot of these concerns, had they published, hey, this is how we've implemented the high-level solution design in AWS, I think that would have neutralized a lot of the criticism and the concern. If I would have probably done something differently, I think the idea of Bluetooth bracelets is interesting, but I think it's also, you could probably do that yourself. And it was something I was looking at of, you could actually get an ESP32 and just broadcast the same characteristics. And so if you wanted to have CovidSafe installed in, say, a restaurant, for example, you could quite easily bomb up an ESP32 and just have this thing broadcasting out the restaurant ID with a static encrypted token. And I think that would be, that would be epic, because quite frankly, the 15 seconds it takes to sign into a restaurant is 15 seconds I could be spent having another old fashioned.
Perfect. We've got Ozlicious from YouTube. The Nexus line has a much older Bluetooth hardware. Would the 60% effective rate improve with more recent Bluetooth?
I don't know. Like I would say there's also other characteristics of what we were doing that you probably need to be thinking about. So you've got to remember, two individuals need to be in close enough proximity. It also needs to trigger in the right way. It also needs to kind of be working through it. I think the success rate had a lot less to do with I would say the success rate had a lot less to do with the Nexus hardware, and had just as much to do with how Bluetooth was, just my personal opinion, how Bluetooth works, which is, unless of course you are in close proximity and waiting for an extended period of time, it's not quite going to all go the way you want it to. So yeah, then again though, if you had dedicated hardware, that would probably be a different story. Found like things like an ESP32 to be quite reliable, but then at that point, it's how do you equip all your citizens with all that hardware to track and follow what they're doing.
All right, next question is from Simon Windows on YouTube. Can you elaborate on the AWS HSM link that you mentioned?
Yeah, so interesting. Let me come back to that. So if you have a look at, and this diagram probably could be it's about right. So if you have a look, the phone, when it's requesting a token, will send content into the AWS environment. That then gets requested, say, from the server. That request then gets passed on to HSM, and then the HSM will use, say, a private key to encrypt that data. That then gets passed on to the phone. So that phone data that then gets broadcast out. So this is purely hypothetical, but this is the way I would design it. This is how you would actually send data in whilst keeping that private key secure. Who asked that? Who asked the question again?
That was Simon Windows.
Okay. Simon, I'm also on SecTalks on the Slack group. And there's, so Simon, feel free to reach out to me via SecTalks. Just want to make sure that I can get your question answered right. I want to make sure I answer your question right. And if I have to, I'll do another write-up just to give clarity on that.
So another technical one from Sang Loke.
Mhm.
How did you record Bluetooth measurements while you're walking with your phone? Was there any specific software that you had to use?
Yeah, so in this case, I was just dumping the contents. So you have in Android, if you put it into developer tools, you have HCI log, which allows you to capture the traffic over Bluetooth and then store it into a file that you can then read in Wireshark later. So that was the tool we were using for the captures there. If you have a look at the database and this diagram, unfortunately, I've made for ants. The bottom piece with the Bluetooth interaction, a record is stored in a local database, which indicates RSSI and the transmit power from the transmitting device. Those values are all recorded from the phone. So
perfect. We got one from Bears314. We know that the Bluetooth solution works better with Apple or Google exposure notification, but it will be more decentralized, which may be less ideal. Is a hybrid system possible within the terms and conditions of the API?
So the last time I actually looked at the proposed API implementation when it was still getting drafted, so I'm not too sure if it would. I think if you could actually get it to a point, actually that's interesting. Could you have it where you're actually associated with a particular geographical area? Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. I'm thinking logically though, if you can have a geographical area with which you associate with that says, this is where I'm at, and then say a health department associate with that. Let me think about that. Sorry. That's
perfect.
That's interesting.
One more from Seng. Bluetooth beacons act like your ESP32 device that you mentioned for restaurant. I think that's a question somewhere in there. Do Bluetooth beacons act like your ESP32 device that you mentioned for the restaurants?
So I'd be curious what you mean by Bluetooth beacons. Are you talking about, if you're talking about the iBeacons, they're a little bit more challenging, especially if you're trying to get it set up for things like the CovidSafe app. Then again, though, like realistically, if you're using things like iBeacons, it could be possible. So my experience with iBeacons though is they can be quite finicky to actually get set up and working. Especially if you ever get a chance, Alibaba has some really cool beacons, but the one we had for one of our classes down at UNSW Canberra was incredibly finicky and incredibly vulnerable. So, but yeah, it's hypothetically, if you could get a beacon set up or use the Bluetooth beacon hardware, it's possible. Yep. So I've just got a dog that's playing ball down here. So sorry, keep it.
All right, I think we've got one more question. This one's from Absolute with a 3 and an underscore. What would be your suggestion to people not wanting to install the CovidSafe app? Would you still encourage them to install the app despite its arguments about privacy issues and its effectiveness?
Look, the whole concept with privacy issues is something I disagree with. I think, I kind of opened this evening with wearing a tinfoil hat quite deliberately, which is, I don't think some of the privacy concerns that have been raised are entirely qualified. I think people have legitimate concerns around privacy. I don't think this is the area where you need to be concerned with privacy. If you're talking about effectiveness, yeah, okay, so be it. but I think if that's going to be your complaint, then go for it. I think the way a lot of it's actually being represented is being probably a little bit more based on rhetoric than actually going out and qualifying. Yeah, this app isn't as effective as it could be. So yeah.
Edward, have you actually spoken to anyone involved in the CovidSafe app, or have they tried reaching out to you?
Not in the app itself. I have spoken to folks at DTA in the past, but I really haven't had much interaction with anyone working in the app or on the app.
Sure. I haven't installed it myself, but that's more because I usually just don't have Bluetooth turned on. I don't think there's any privacy concern. So yeah, it would be interesting to know if anyone here has changed their mind about CovidSafe based on this research. And is there any further research you'd like to do, or you'd like to see maybe hand off to anyone else in the community to do?
There's a part of me that would have liked to have actually done a much more larger scale sit down and walk through and actually see if, in a crowded environment, as we start to unlock Sydney, if the app is as effective as tracing as it can be, because then that should really go back to feeding in and informing, are we going to be able to trace everyone? And I think that's probably another thing to think about with decision makers. Is someone's actually said, yes, this app is perfect, it's going to trace everyone, and we're going to be able to quickly deal with a problem as it comes up. I'm concerned that we may not be able to do that quick tracing, so expectation management's kind of gone to shit there.
Sure. I think that might be all the questions. I'm just going to check all the channels real quick. Slack, IRC, and YouTube. Other than that, is there anything else that you want to plug? Do you want people to reach out to you regarding this research anywhere in particular?
No, not particularly. Here was just some cool stuff I did. Feel free to keep doing cool stuff. I think, as I said, I think the cool place will be seeing, will Bluetooth represent will be over the next 12 months with some of the research that's just been published on Bluetooth. What's the effect of that going to be in the space whilst everyone has Bluetooth still turned on? I think that's going to be the curious piece here. If anyone has any other questions, who am I listed as under Slack? Yep, I'm listed as Faz, F-A-Z. Feel free to reach out to me on Slack. There's also the QR code I had in the back of the slides here as well. So yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to have a chat. In fact, let me bring that down here. Cool. So that's the way to get in contact with me.
Perfect. I'll just leave that QR code up for a few seconds for anyone who wants to see that. As always, this talk is now on the SecTalks Slack channel, and as I think the previous 5, 6, however many months we've been doing this, it feels like about 36 months. You can actually watch them all on demand now, which is kind of I guess the benefit of bringing these to you. Before this, we actually had a few of them recorded while still going live at the venue. But now all of them have been obviously broadcast on YouTube, which is our new home for now and the foreseeable future. So yeah, you can go back and rewatch this as much as you like, and also don't forget to check out the previous talks as well. Mm-hmm. Again, if you have any talks you'd like to do, we're looking for speakers for the next few months. So September, October, November, we don't have. I think we have. We just want to close out the year. We've got someone for December already, and we also have, of course, the Ninja Nights every month as well, which are our Capture the Flag online challenge tournament kind of competition thingos, which I don't know if one's been announced, but keep an eye on the meetups page. That's where we announce all of our events. And again, these are all brought to you by the community. So just people like yourselves, if you're in here, you're part of the community. So please reach out to us if you have anything interesting you'd like to speak about. Other than that, again, thanks Ed for the talk. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, folks, and yeah, see ya.
All right, see you all later.